Hello, everyone. It's October, and I'm back with another episode. Today's guest is my friend Chris Smith, and we got connected through Lee, who was on the podcast back in April, May ish, and it's taken us a little bit of time to connect and schedule things, but this was such a fun conversation. We do get into some spiritual influences and Chris's influence of Buddhism. And you guys know my faith journey as a part of this podcast. So it was fun to hear his story, hear his struggles, and also kind of get the spiritual wisdom that the journey he's been on, which I love, which is awesome and something I want to keep doing on this podcast. So, guys, without further ado, Chris is also the host of a really fun podcast called Chatty Geek Hidden Dragon, and I'll put all that info in the notes. But here's my talk with Chris Smith.
And so, what are some of the mental health challenges that you've had? I know I've used the word diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe people have to have a diagnosis to struggle. I think it's like you just struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've been close to like seeing a doctor and them saying, "Hey, I think you have this." But where did some of these challenges kind of start for you?
Well, I've got to the point where I've had to see a doctor and talk about my mental health 3 times in my life. To be truthful with you, I've found 2 of those times to be unsatisfactory. In my own experience, I tended to, the first time I visited the doctor and I thought, look, I just don't feel happy. I wasn't on a suicidal scale at that point. But I was definitely, looking back now, experiencing depression. Unquestionably, I was experiencing depression. When I spoke to the doctor, it came across, whether he meant to or not, it came across the way he treated me as if I was just looking for an excuse to get a sick note so I didn't have to go to work. That's how he basically, that is the impression I got. And he kind of, I don't know if you know the expression fobbed me off, which just means like, yeah, okay. And I got like a few leaflets, which I could have got anywhere. I could have got them from Asda if I wanted.
What is a leaflet?
You know, like a pamphlet, information pamphlets you give as well. Well, there's these people who might be able to help you.
I'm like, America, England, America.
Yeah.
Yeah. We call it a pamphlet, man.
Pamphlet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, that's my personal experience with that. I think over the years I've come to recognize that mental health is a bit like a weather system. For most people, in that it fluctuates in a very much the same way, and it can be affected in very much the same way. So sometimes the weather is rainy, sometimes it's incredibly stormy, and sometimes it's sunny, and it kind of changes. And if we recognize that, it becomes a bit more recognizable that it's not something that's wrong with us. It's just fluctuations in mental health.
Right.
And yeah, so going back to your question, yeah, my mental health, I haven't had a diagnosis, although I have come to learn about myself that I do find certain things difficult that I feel that I shouldn't find difficult. I find inconsistencies in social structure kind of freak me out a little bit, if that makes any sense. So if I can give an example, so if I go to so I practice martial arts, and we do like very traditional karate environments and stuff, and sometimes we'll go to certain events where I will expect the people around me to be very serious. And then there's certain situations where we can be a bit more friendlier and a lot more relaxed and informal. And sometimes those overlap. And for me, I find that difficult if people are like sort of being relaxed when I'm expecting people to be serious, and when or I try and relax when I think it's the appropriate time to relax and be more friendly and informal. And they're like, well, what you talking to me like that for? You should call me master this or sir or mom.
Yeah.
Or so that, and I find that really, really, really awkward. So yeah, that's kind of the lowdown on my mental health and experience. I find that the reason I am so passionate now is I've come to recognize that mental health affects everything we do. All of the decisions we choose to make is definitely affected by our mental health, and how we interpret everything around us also affects our mental health, and that in turn affects how we react to the things that are happening around us. So we've got this very complicated web of cause and effect and interaction between our mental health and our environment and ourselves inside our own heads, and how we choose to act.
Yeah.
It's
thanks for sharing.
That's all right.
Definitely like your analogy of the weather system for sure. And I do think my experience is growing up in America, and obviously your experience, we're in different places, but it's like everyone has a brain, and it's what's kind of I've talked about a lot on here is like it's an unseen thing a lot of the times, right? Like, people close to you can kind of pick up on. You can't completely hide things like 100%, right? Like if you are, let's say, sad or like super worried, people close to you will kind of can tell sometimes, right? Like, hey, are you okay? But a lot of times we do spend a lot of time by ourselves in our own. I mean, all of us are in our own heads like 24/7. I mean, maybe you're dreaming when you sleep, so that's a break. But then you have a weird dream and you're like, I'm back in my head. So sometimes what happens is and I think especially as men, we do sort of deal with that in our own ways, kind of on our own first. I think that's our instinct, is to just kind of hide or deal with it on our own. And I think this crisis that we've had of obviously suicide and especially since COVID, all these things, it's sort of forcing culture, society to be like, hey, we need to like at least start having conversations about it. And so is that what now you're kind of on a path? You have the podcast, and I'm curious to know how that started, and then also you're kind of wanting to do this as like a profession. Which I've done a little bit of school in this stuff, but not probably as much as you. So, is that what was the start, or what was the reason for the podcast, and how did you decide to call it Chatty Geek Hidden
Hidden
based
Dragon
on the movie, right?
The Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
I've only seen like parts of it where they're running in trees, or not running in trees, but well, whatever. They're on top of trees, and I'm just like, how do you film this? No.
I've tried myself, but I keep falling out the tree.
Nice.
But yes,
stunt doubles.
I'll never be a stunt double. I'm probably far too clumsy for that. So basically what happened for me is it was all linked to my martial arts and my Buddhist practice. So this all started about 25 years ago. And the last time I graded was about 3 years ago, which I graded to 4th Dan in my martial arts. And part of the requirements for that is we were requested to investigate with this new grade and with this sort of at 4th Dan in our federation. That is sort of the nod that we are now officially able to pass on the tradition of our style, so we can teach. Essentially, we're official teachers. So part of the requirement was that we were asked to put a lot of thought into how we wanted to pass on the art and how we wanted to influence and things like that. And this is what got me thinking. So obviously martial arts is a self-defense, and it's a form of protecting ourselves against harm, mostly from other people. Now, one of the things that some instructors will teach is that they will believe that we need to include defense, for example, against a weapon, like for a knife or a stick or something like that. Okay. Well, so I looked at this and I thought, well, if you look at the statistics, the people who are killed by knife crime in the UK, it was very, very low. It was something like maybe 2 or 3 people in a year were actually killed by a knife crime. Oh, wow. When I looked at the statistics for people who are killed through suicide, that's massively more.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, is it really wise to be concentrating on helping people defend themselves against something which is statistically very unlikely to happen? You're more likely to get hit by a car. Right. Should we be maybe putting more attention into teaching our students how we can learn to be more knowledgeable and wise and compassionate with ourselves, so we are able to not to make our mind the enemy, but to learn to understand and protect ourselves from the mind? So when we're going through depression, how can we learn to recognize and prevent ourselves going down a path which could lead to self-harm or worse? And this is what I really wanted to integrate into my style of teaching martial arts. And through my Buddhist practice, I'd learned that we can teach people to understand themselves, but also understand other people, but also have compassion and forgiveness for themselves, understanding that our negative thoughts are a natural thing. Like I say, that it is the weather system that is affected by stuff that is out of our control. And be able to allow that to happen without it leading to confusion and actions that can harm ourselves. And so that is self-defense against ourselves in some way. Yeah. But there's a bit of confusion because it's not to make ourselves the enemy sort of thing, or not to make, people sometimes will say that or describe demons being inside them.
Right.
Which right. Suddenly creates a separation within yourself, as if we've got you in one respect and then something or other going on inside that is kind of an enemy. And through the Buddhist practice and through martial arts and just through my life and lots of meditation and trying to understand ourselves, we kind of learn to realize that this demon actually sometimes is just still is part of the confused little child that is still inside of us sometimes, or just, the lost, upset little person that's inside of us that really just needs a bit of a cuddle and an arm around it, rather than to be demonized and say, no, get out of my head.
Right.
And this is how it all started. So I've begun with a podcast that was called Eternal Spring. And it was a very focused niche podcast to do with mental health, but specifically with martial arts and Buddhism in mind. But I found that for me personally, it was far too niche for me. I wasn't able to speak to as many people as I wanted to speak to. I felt that I was kind of not being fair to people that fell outside of this niche, because I wanted to allow my ideas to fall on people that were willing to listen and not exclude them just because they weren't Buddhist martial artists, for example.
Right.
And also I wanted to speak to people from outside of my niche as well. I wanted to speak to people from all walks of life and share ideas from, like I say, all kinds of experience and from all different angles, just so I could encourage a bit of social amalgamation, if that's a good way of putting it, where everybody is putting their ideas together, and you can just take what works and leave what doesn't, and without excluding people or just saying, I only want to hear your ideas, I don't want to hear from you, and that kind of thing. So it was all about Chatty Geek Hidden Dragon was born from being a Chatty Geek, which is what I am. But also
awesome.
but also trying to address that sort of hidden wisdom that is within ourselves, that is within all of us somewhere through experience, and encouraging the sharing of that.
Wow, well, you just said a lot of really interesting things to me. Thanks for sharing that. I was about to joke and say, I think I'm a Chatty Geek too, but
you are.
Yes, probably as much as I was saying that I, make fun of the people around me that play video games. No, I'm kidding. And they probably make fun of me for, watching shows. No. Yeah, we're all kind of pretty dorky, right? It's like, what is cool? Cool is like what you're trying to figure out when you're in like junior high, and then as you get older, you're like, what the heck, man? Why do we spend so much time on that? But yeah, I like how you. There was this book I read a long time ago when I was when I was an aspiring screenwriter. Okay,
right.
And this is just from my childhood of like loving movies, being an actor, and this guy was breaking down kind of the different types of stories, right? Like he said like man versus the elements, right? When you see like a survival show, right? Like Bear Grylls, Man versus Wild, right? And then, but one of the things was man versus himself, right? Like sometimes it's like to some extent, really every story is kind of you against you, but a lot of times it's like conflict in a story is always like us versus other people. If we don't have that, then it's not interesting. And I think mental health is very much like you versus yourself, kind of back to the thing where it's hidden. And sure, the long-term coping skill is community and connection. You realize that what keeps you sane is experiencing kind of love from other people. But that's also hard to figure out how to do that. And so what do you think is like the reason why, when you're saying like compassion, right? Maybe what's the reason for like a lack of compassion? Because I found that in my struggles, it's very much like I'm hard on myself. Kind of this inner critic is, man, I'm just like beating myself up over like I should have done that, I should have done that. Or I think if people have episodes of where they're like, I got off my meds and now I'm going, not to overuse the word crazy, but I'm losing control. And it's like, wow, what do you think about yourself in this moment? Because I know for me, it's like, what's not helping the chaos is this relationship I have with myself. And it's like there's very little compassion and there's very little mercy. And then now I do have empathy for other people. Now I'm not like losing my mind anymore. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, where do you get compassion?
Yeah.
Has that been part of the Buddhist journey? Is that through meditation? Is that just through because I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, all of it. You've said some really great things there. So I'm trying to jot down the keywords of what you've mentioned so I can try and get it all addressed. But no, you've said some really good stuff there. So we go back to the man versus himself. So in Buddhism, but also I think if we look at it philosophically as well, there's a problem that we face when we have man versus himself, in that we have that dualism created. And by that, what I mean is we've split up one thing into two things. So you've got man versus himself. So if we were to investigate the phrase, which part of us are we saying is the man and which part of us are we saying is the himself? because we're both the same one. And also, I just want to quickly do a quick disclaimer. If I use the word ignorance in a Buddhist sense, it's not a derogatory term. It just references the fact that we forget stuff and we're unaware of things. So that's all I mean by that. So if I'm saying if I'm saying anything is ignorance, I just want people to say I'm not being derogatory or anything like that.
Right.
So I think where we sometimes forget empathy or we forget compassion is because we forget within ourselves that this demon is actually part of ourselves. And the one of the key things that we learn that we're taught in Buddhist systems is that everybody is the same, in that everybody wants to be happy and they don't want to suffer. So that basic primal need that everybody has is that they will choose actions that will cause them, that will bring happiness and will avoid suffering. And this is that is just part of what is within ourselves. And some of that is down to survival. So if you're feeling hungry, for example, you will get some food, and the food will make you happy, and it will stop you feeling hungry. So that is, in that sense, there's survival there. If we're out in the Sahara and we see a big lion running at us, we will avoid that lion. We're not gonna because
try to pet it.
Because running away is going to prevent the inevitable suffering that we can sort of foresee is going to happen if it gets a hold of us.
Right.
So this is like the basics. So in some respects, it is a survival mechanism.
Right.
Now there's a difference between the long-term happiness and the short-term happiness. Now, the short-term happiness isn't a bad thing. Yeah, you're allowed to get short-term happiness. You're allowed a bar of chocolate, or you're allowed to, make fun with friends and have a joke about. And if you want to have a drink, if you're a drinker, then you can have a drink and all that kind of thing. But the thing about the short-term happiness is it eventually wears off.
Right.
Yeah, we get to the end of the cookie, or we get to the bottom of the glass, or we're having a great time with friends, but eventually we have to go home again, and whether we live on our own or we have to go back to work at some point, etc. So what happens is the mind, or ourselves, depending on our experience, on what our life has looked like, our brain will have learned over, in my case, my 41 years, that my brain has picked up certain things that it can tell me to do, or that it can decide to do, that depending on how I'm feeling, if I want a quick fix, or if I can be more mindful and choose an action that will bring on long-term or more longer-term beneficial stuff. And it knows, if I see a spider in the house, I will pick it up most of the time. If I'm being wise, and I'll put him outside or her outside, and things like that. So now sometimes, because of this, though, the mind gets a little bit confused. It gets confused because we forget, or we're ignorant, that everything is changing all of the time, and what brings us happiness generally doesn't last. So we forget that we're going to get to the end of the bar of chocolate. When we go to Benidorm for 2 weeks for a holiday, we forget that holiday is going to come to an end. And we have the ultimate impermanence, which is our lives and the lives of our loved ones. And we forget that, we become ignorant on purpose, because to remind ourselves all the time can make us a little bit sad. But we forget that, these things are going to eventually happen. So when they do happen, we get into a bit of a struggle. And we try and find ways, and we'll scramble around, try and find ways that are gonna lift us up. Sometimes we can make wise decisions, sometimes we can make unwise decisions. But what causes the compassion is we forget that this process is happening within ourselves. And sometimes when we're not making the right decisions, we forget that our mind is just kind of being how it's naturally designed to be. We fall into the trap of thinking that there's something wrong with us, or that there is the demon inside that's causing, or that we'll forget and we'll feel that we need to be punished, or we'll get all of these thoughts in our heads. And this is what causes the lack of compassion and the lack of empathy in others. And we forget that everybody is subject to this process. So, if somebody cuts us up in the traffic, I like the example of somebody cutting us up in the traffic, and we kind of wave our hands at them and call them all sorts of names.
Yeah.
So we're doing this
every day.
Yeah. Warrior. So you do all this shouting at them, and we're shouting at them because the brain is immediately pretty ticked off of the car cutting us up and wants to be happy. It doesn't want to suffer. So sometimes it wants justice, sometimes it wants a bit of retribution. So we'll do that, and that gives us a little bit of that short-term relief. And that for a moment is a little bit of the ignorance and the lack of compassion for ourselves, because we've forgotten that is very, very temporary, and it's not really going to make us feel any better. In fact, many times that when I've waved my fist at someone, I feel like I've been a bit silly for the rest of the day, and it ingrains it into my brain for the rest of the day, and it put me in a bad mood. Is what happens. So what I need to do, if he cuts me up or she cuts me up, is just let them in. Now, we're fall into the trap of demonizing the driver that's cut us up. They could be late for their baby being born, or they could have someone in the car that's injured and needs to go to hospital, or they could be late for an interview or something like that, and they're doing what their brain is telling them to do, which is, sorry, but I'm going to cut in here, and I'm in a rush, and I need to do what's going to make me happy, which is getting there sooner and not being late.
Yeah.
So it's all connected. It's all interconnected. And then the lack of empathy and compassion can come when we forget that. We forget that it's all connected, and we forget that we're all the same. That was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I love it, man. I love the conversation. I mean, I think it's important to talk about, because I know in my experiences of being in the hospital, which I've talked a lot about on the podcast, and I gratefully haven't been in a hospital in a couple of years, but just as an example, being in a psychiatric hospital, usually if people hear that word, they're thinking of, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson or something, right? Or what you've seen in movies where it's like, oh, I never want to go there, and so scary. But when, one of the things that always stood out to me was I've been very blessed with having lots of friends, community. Before COVID, you could go visit people if they're in the psych hospital. So my mom would come, and I'd be just so overwhelmed with people. But you would really learn pretty quickly, like most people in the hospital had really like no support. And so it's like, man, to have empathy on, I'm not saying you need to go to a hospital to learn that, but just being in that position where you do get to talk to people, and you learn like, wow, this person is really hard on themselves. This person is not having much compassion on themselves. And also they have like no support system, right? And unfortunately, at least in America, it's like, look, people, they kick you out after like a week, right? It's like a week is not enough time to deal with maybe a lifetime of trauma. And they kind of ask people, like, the first question is like, do you have friends? Do you have somebody you can go back to? Do you have a doctor? And most people are like, I don't got anybody. Like, the most friends I've made is in this hospital in the last week.
Right.
And it's, I mean, no, I mean, it's not really funny, but it's like, oh, wow. And, you know, you get people's phone numbers, you become best friends with people in the hospital.
Yeah.
And like, that really can save someone's life. So I like what you're saying, that part of it is that we get into survival mode. And I think if you do have mental health challenges, it can be very self-consuming, where you just feel like you're talking about yourself all the time, or you're just so caught up in your thing. It's hard to look around. And but yeah, I like what you were saying too about suffering, because a lot of mental health, I guess some people don't like the word illness, so I guess I interchange it with like mental health challenges. Mental, you know, illness might sound too I don't know. I don't know what you think about that, but like, kind of, uh, do you think some of this is just that there's sort of an unwillingness to embrace hard things? So sometimes it's like, you know, look, if you have anxiety for like 3 weeks, your temptation is like, I need medication, right? And I'm not saying don't go on meds, but at least here, I don't know what it's like where you live, there is a lot of that, where it's like, it's kind of easy to just maybe try to get medication to relieve yourself of the suffering. But instead, what we need to be teaching people, and I'm not against meds, my opinion's kind of changed over the years. You need to teach people how to sort of embrace these discomforts, kind of like what you're saying. Like, you go for the chocolate, or you go for the drink, or you go for maybe sex or whatever. And then it's like you're left with kind of this emptiness at the end of the day. And so I don't know what your experience is with that. Like, is some of this just learning how to get in touch with our own kind of discomfort so we can like move through it, and instead of numbing ourselves out, you know? And I think that's a human thing, or maybe it's more of a masculine thing, you know, like drink, watch sports, party, you know, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, the wheels have to fall off that wagon eventually if we do keep going like that. I think your question was, is some of this just down to, can you just repeat that bit? Is some of it just down to understanding ourselves? Is that kind of where your question was coming from?
Commenting on what you're saying and then giving my own. Yeah, I was saying, like, how do you embrace pain and suffering?
Right.
Because what I hear you saying is kind of that if you're present with yourself, instead of cutting the person off, right, you would have some patience.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's like we're really uncomfortable with any kind of conflict or thing, and that can be just from maybe how we were raised or abuse, or, you know, how do you embrace suffering? Or is that also kind of something you've learned with your spiritual focuses? Because I only did 1 day of dang it, what's it called, jujitsu.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I did a bunch of years ago. I went with some guys I worked with, and everyone's on the mat, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. But I was like, this is cool, kind of, I guess.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know there's all these different disciplines, but a lot of it is, I mean, I guess I've played sports. Is you got to be present with yourself, or else you make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you're not present, you can't really do a good job of like. That's when you mess up, you know. So I was kind of asking, like, how do you practice embracing discomfort and embracing maybe suffering? Does that actually help you move through some of these things, you know?
Really good question. Again, loads of stuff there. I've been jotting. I'm surprised there's not smoke. You can't see smoke coming off my paper where I'm trying to write the keywords. I love all this stuff. So
for sure.
Right. Okay. So the first bit is it a case of just understanding ourselves and learning to understand what the suffering is?
Yeah.
In some cases, yes. In some cases, we need extra help. So sometimes it can be in the form of medication. And again, I am in no way qualified to say whether it is or not required. I'll just quickly say that.
Me too. Yeah, I'm just speaking from my experience. Yeah.
However, what I would say, and what I think, again, we forget, and it's something that thankfully these days is said often, is this journey, even though, so that kind of is an oversimplification, because there's people that need additional help, and a little bit more. So whether that is seeing a counselor, seeing a psychotherapist, or which could lead onto medication. One of the key things that I would mention is that none of us and nobody has to find this understanding on their own. And you mentioned a great thing yourself, whereas where you were in the hospital, you made great friends and you sort of made these connections. And what's happening there is you're finding peers of some form where you've got this common ground, and there is the kind of not necessarily in terms of the same, symptoms or experiences, but in terms where you're kind of not satisfied with the relationship between mind and environment, maybe we can say, and how we are finding ourselves understanding the world, and how our understanding of the world is actually making us feel. And we don't have to do it on our own. And you don't have to speak to a counselor. You can speak to friends. If you're lucky to have friends, or you can find groups. One of the great things about social media is there are groups that we can find where we can sort of introduce ourselves to people and just talk about experiences and see if we can find people that have got common ground. Because when you do this journey on our own, it is very easy to get lost in it. Sometimes we can think we've come across as a pearl of wisdom, but actually it can sometimes just be a distraction, which eventually we get lost anyway. So what we can do is, if we find a peer or a friend that we can talk to, it's good, because we then have somebody that we can bounce our ideas off and bounce our experiences off. And obviously, if we also find ourselves getting a little bit confused, if we think we've found this pearl of wisdom, which sometimes may not be, maybe, just for a silly example, you find great relief in the idea that actually we don't need to worry about anything because this is all a dream. Let's just say that we come up with this idea. Now, that is a pearl of wisdom that you would call yourself, that is finding you great relief, and you could get away with months of, I'm just actually in a dream. This is not real. It doesn't actually matter. Eventually, that won't last, and it can lead to actually lead to more confusion. And as we talked about the relationship between our mental health and the actions we choose, the fact that we think we're in a dream, it could lead to us making silly decisions on the actions we decide to do, like becoming Neo from the Matrix or something like that.
Yes, let's talk about the Matrix. No,
man. So that's kind of thing. So what I would say is important is we find peers. We don't feel that if we're struggling, we have to do it on our own. It's very important. Then we shifted to martial arts. So then we shifted to martial arts. Now, how this all amalgamates together for me personally is a key phrase I will always have, like a bit of a mantra, and I have it on my screen in front of me so I can always refer to it if I'm on a show or something. So one of the phrases I always use is opposite action. So that's not opposite. So opposite action means the most appropriate thing you could possibly do. So opposite is the most appropriate. So when we are doing a martial arts. Now, whether it is a striking style of martial art like boxing or taekwondo or, you know, Muay Thai, something like that, or whether you're doing like sort of a continuous contact style, for example, like a wrestling or a judo or an aikido or a jiu-jitsu, there is a most appropriate thing to do. And so let's take an example. Let's say someone in the pub has had too much to drink and he decides to swing a punch. So there's three actions that I could do. There's more, but let's say there's three actions I could do. One is I could stand there and just allow him to hit me in the face. The other action I could do is I could break his arm and his legs. Let's just make it really extreme, right? And then the other action I could do is I could do the block with the minimal amount of force. So it's what is the most appropriate thing to do? So when we bring the empathy and the compassion into it, the alcohol has confused the guy straight away.
Mm-hmm.
And amongst other things, maybe he's got peer pressure. Maybe he is trying to fill this man role, you know, this brute, you know, one of the lads kind of boy
what
role.
You see in the movies a lot.
Yeah, he's trying to, you know, trying to be tough, or maybe maybe he's trying to impress girls or something like that. Who knows? So, but there's behind that punch, before there is footing and balance and muscle activation, there's always confusion. There's always confusion before every action that an attacker does. Now, an attacker could be a drug addict and he could be needing our wallet, and his brain is telling us to be happy, I need drugs. To get drugs, to stop suffering, I need to get drugs. To do that, I need his wallet. Give me your wallet, sort of thing. Or the guy is in the pub and he's saying, I don't want to suffer. I feel like I'm not being noticed. I feel like I'm not being heard. The guy has looked at me in a way that he's obviously misinterpreted. Maybe he's there. I'm going to hit him. The way I'm going to be happy is if I punch him in the face. For some reason, that's what he thinks. So at the beginning of all of this is confusion. So we have empathy for that. So, and we also remember that we're the same. We want to be happy. We don't want to suffer. So I don't deserve to be punished for wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer, because who's to say? Because everybody's the same. And he doesn't deserve to be punished. He's just confused about what he needs to do to be happy. So the question is, does he deserve to have his arms and legs broken? No, he doesn't. But also, do I deserve to be punched in the face because he's confused? No, I don't. So what we try and find in martial arts, personally, this is my own personal opinion, is opposite action. What is that most appropriate thing? And that is the action that we choose that leads to what I would call the best karmic outcome. So we're looking at karma now. So how do I find the action that causes the least amount of suffering to both parties? And how do I find that? How do I find it? Sometimes it could be moving out the way, just getting out the pub. And this is where we come to understand our own suffering, their suffering, our own confusion and their confusion. And, you know, discomfort in martial arts, you learn very quickly, is something that happens. You're put in uncomfortable situations. And actually to find, for me, why I'm so passionate about martial arts and what I love about martial arts is we get to try and find opposite action. We get to try and find wisdom in one of the most stressful environments I can imagine, which is in confrontation, where someone is either trying to cause harm or take something from me, or, you know, inflict pain on me. And yet I'm still learning, how can I find the correct, most opposite action? And that's why martial arts, and that's why I love that's why compassion and empathy plays a role in martial arts as well.
For sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, we've gotten into a lot of deep stuff here. I just decided to just jump right in. But that's what I love about doing the podcast, and I know that you probably have a similar approach to your podcast where you like to talk to people, and obviously I'll put the link to your podcast in this notes. And I also like that you do what I've tried to do too, which is kind of these like solo episodes. You call it journal, which is I'm assuming is kind of more like a personal recap of your life, which is cool. I love that. So I don't know if you see journal in any of my titles, then you can sue me for the copyright.
You're fine.
Louder now, journal. Oh man. Well, yeah, I think it's just, I think I said this before we started recording. It's like obviously we're both men, and I like what you said, and it's kind of maybe a good segue to sort of wrap this conversation up, and maybe we can do part 2 in the future or something. I love that. I have said that to a lot of other people, so now I got to follow through. Be like, anyway, I've had a lot of guests, so it's like now I could be like, let's take half of the people and have them come back. But yeah, I like what you're saying about getting help, because a lot of this is like, and even you talking about martial arts and your Buddhist influence is really, it's just like, I think what happens is sometimes when we get stuck and we feel like lack of hope, right? The hopelessness is kind of coming from what you were also saying earlier too, which is that things are always changing. Right? And I think when we get stuck, there's like a real strong belief that things can't change, right? It's like you would ask someone like, do you think you can get better? Right. And I mean, even if you are so stuck and feeling suicidal or despairing, I mean, I've been there. Right. A lot of times you're just thinking like, this is it, man. Like whatever I'm feeling now, because as humans, we're made to experience emotions. So when we feel not so great, I mean, we really feel that. And that's part of what's awesome about being a human. It's obviously doesn't feel awesome if you only feel bad like all day, every day, right? So anyway, I think it's cool to talk about, do you believe that you can change, right? And I think we all know we can change, or things can change, or both can change. And anyway, so I know there's medication, but there's also what you're also saying, which is like talk to people if you can. And even as men, it's kind of like, oh, I don't want to go, open up about my depression. I want to just watch this sports game and jump around and, talk about girls or whatever. And it's like, cool, well, you can do that too, but like, find someone that you can kind of do a podcast with in the middle of the day, like this. No. But yeah, man, okay. So my last question for you would be, and again, I know we can keep going, so table this for next time. But well, first of all, thanks for sharing what you have shared, and thanks for being vulnerable and being.
It's a pleasure.
But yeah, what do you think people, if they are feeling really stuck, maybe it's suicidal thoughts, maybe it's not, but it's just where maybe they feel hopeless, or all of the above of these different emotions. What advice do you give to the person who is like probably listening to this because they feel hopeless, or a certain level of hopelessness, and they're listening to kind of get hope,
Okay.
What do you say to that person?
Well, the first thing I would say is that change is universal. So everything is changing all the time. Nothing stays the same, but that includes the way you are now. So if you're I'm feeling pretty happy. I'm on the Louder Now podcast. I'm buzzing on life. But we've got to come to an end. You said yourself, we've got the sad times coming because we've got to hang up. And
I know, man.
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad. but
2
we have the
hours of
hope.
this? No.
Yeah, we have the hope that there's part 2 coming one day.
Yeah,
But
Chris has
anyway,
to go to bed, guys. We're on different time zones.
Yeah, but seriously, like, change is universal.
Yeah,
and it is continuous. In fact, the common phrase is the only constant in life is change. The only thing that is guaranteed is change. Now, if you're going through a hard time, if you stick at it, if you stay with it, you can know that it is going to change. Now we try and find hope, and we try and find faith, which is connected also. And faith is an incredibly powerful tool to help us keep going, and to have faith in the fact that change is universal, and the fact that, you know, if we stick at it, it will be okay. Now, a lot of people might be sat there that see the getting better, you know, if they are not satisfied with where they are now, where their mind is now, when they want to get better, or they want to be in a better place, you can sometimes be confused by seeing this as a massive epic requirement. You know, you see this journey as being like on the other side of the ocean of you know, I'm here, and me being in a better place, I've got to swim the whole ocean to get there. And when we look at it like that, it feels like it is just too much, right? So what I would stress is that we remember to go from moment to moment. In Buddhism, we use the phrase mindfulness and being in the present. But really, to make it more accessible for everybody, just look at the moment to moment. Look at the small wins on that journey across the ocean. And the faith comes in is that if you look at the small wins, you will, before you know it, if you just stick to that moment, take the small wins, take the victories, then before you know it, you will be on the other side of the ocean, and you will get there. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say we're trying to think of a good example, but let's say that we are sat on the sofa, and, you know, we're in a really bad place, and we don't think we can make the next hour. Well, how about we just make the next 5 minutes? How about we make the next minute? How about, if you need to, come back to yourself, and how about we just take one breath at a time? Breathe in, breathe out if you need to. Yeah, maybe then we can do 5 breaths. Maybe then we can do 10 breaths. You know, maybe if you want to, maybe if you can't leave the house, maybe you're in a place where you can't leave the house. Well, then maybe, how about we crack the window open? How about we open the back door and look outside? How about we find those small wins and those small victories, which will get us through while the big change is happening? Because the big change is happening. That is where the hope and the faith comes from. The big change is happening now as you're listening to this podcast. Everything is interacting with each other. Everything is changing. And, you know, if you look at those small victories, then you will get there. And we're all here cheering you on. This is another thing to remember. You know, Jared, me, and, you know, a massive mental health community on podcasts, social media, TVs. We're all here cheering you on.
Yeah, that's
just one step at a time, man. That's all it is.
Yeah, man. Wow, that's great. I love it. Yeah, I'm stealing this from like some TV show, but the dad, he had this line. He was like, "It's not about what he knows, you know, it's about how he feels." And it was like you know, kid was a teenager going through teenage stuff, but it is true that, I mean, what we know affects what we do and how we feel. That's true. There's a connection. But oftentimes the stuckness is an emotion, right? It's like, I literally don't feel good about anything that I'm doing. So when you're in that, like you said, just 1 minute at a time, and the breathing thing is very important. And also it's that you can't really look for the feeling. You got to just keep, I don't want to say it, oversimplify it, but you have to just keep moving, like keep doing things, keep being around people, keep journaling, keep writing things down, you know, just get through the day. And you can't stay in the same place for, you know, forever, right? It's like eventually something's gonna shift, you know. And yes, we're not professionals. We're just speaking from our experience. So even my commentary on medications, I'm not saying don't go get meds. Go speak to a doctor. I heard your episode on taking people 28 days to get help where you live.
Oh yeah.
You know what, that might be true in America. Not that that's funny, but no, I mean, if you can look with COVID, there's a lot of things that have changed with healthcare, right? It's like, hey, I need an appointment with the doctor. And it's like, oh, it's going to be 3 weeks. You're like, dude, I need to talk to somebody like right now.
Yeah. A lot can happen in 3 weeks.
Yeah. So I do always post the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. There's also, I think, Pound 988 is a new thing here in the States. So last thing, you have a podcast, and I know it's on a bunch of different platforms. Where can people kind of get a hold of you to listen and watch your podcast and other information?
Yep. Just search for Chatty Geek Hidden Dragon. Go into Google and you'll just see me. There's no one else is crazy enough to use that name. So Chatty Geek Hidden Dragon.
You got lucky.
Yeah, I got lucky. So yeah, Chatty Geek Hidden Dragon, you'll find us there. We're Chatty Geek Hidden Dragon on all the social medias. Twitter, it's Chatty Geek HD for Delta. So yeah.
Cool.
That's where we are on Twitter.
Awesome. And
cool.
Thanks again. Okay.
See you later.
See ya.
All right, guys. Like I said in the intro, I'll put all of Chris's information in the notes, and he does do a live stream show. Goes on Facebook and YouTube, and then also you can find it on his website. And I'm gonna be a guest on it coming up in sort of the third week-ish of November, so I'm excited for that. And guys, refer to the end of show notes for some resources. I have a new Instagram, and I'd love it if you guys could leave a review on Apple. That would really help me out a lot. I'm working on getting a new website right now, so that will also be a launch for that, which should be fun. So thank you guys for listening to the Louder Now podcast. I'm your host, Jared, and we'll see you next time.